Oh, progress. But I'm going to stop for a little while because I've sort of half made a promise to tell a little bit of a story. A little bit of a story to help George understand more about the Faber family and to help Lord Muck with his quest for flying stories. Now, the Faber family, they include some very interesting and very important people. We think of dear Hiram Faber, who built a grist mill on the Shade Tree Fix-It railway place. And sometimes some of us Fabers have to admit that we're not very good at a lot of things. Some of us may be brilliant pilots, but it's a matter of public record that we're rubbish navigators. You know, who else but a Faber could possibly go to Cologne 4 times in one day when he was trying to get to Frankfurt? You know, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to clear some dust out of my throat and tell a little story. One of the reasons why we should be slow to rush into any sort of war is because sometimes you will find yourself on opposite sides in that war to people from your own family. So while the Faber family of history was grinding flour to make bread to help the war effort in America and Canada and sending loaves to England and Britain, the other side of the channel there were other Fabers who were caught up fighting for one of the more evil regimes in history. Sadly, not the worst, one of the worst. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about one of our second cousins 4 or 5 times removed, who was a brilliant pilot. Now, famously, he's not remembered for being a brilliant pilot, but for being a lousy navigator. And for people living in Great Britain, we say that the Second World War started on the 3rd of September 1939. If you were Polish, you would say the 1st of September. Possibly if you were German, you might say that it started at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. But all of that aside, we come to look at a time in history when the German Air Force had aeroplanes that were better than the British Air Force. Many of you think about Spitfires as being the supreme, all-conquering, wonderful aeroplane. And if you're lucky, you will have met Spitfire pilots. And just a brief word about fighter pilots. They've all got double-jointed wrists. Because when you get in a conversation with a pilot, especially a fighter pilot, they fly their aeroplanes around like that. And they say, there was this Stuka in a dive and I came down behind him, and they do all of that sort of thing. But the Spitfire was not always the best aeroplane ever. And the Germans had built some incredibly good aeroplanes, including a type that I think of as the Focke-Wulf 190. Some of you will call it a butcher bird or Sturmvogel, various names for it. And it was better than the Spitfire. So much better that Churchill was considering sending the commandos across to France to see if they could grab one and see how good it was. Now, into this story comes a Faber. Oberleutnant Armin Faber. A pilot with the German Air Force, brilliant pilot, lousy navigator, and he took off one day in a Focke-Wulf 190 and he got in a punch-up with some Spitfires. The Spitfires were being flown by Czech pilots, Czechs in the Royal Air Force, and they were out covering an attack by some Bostons, American aeroplanes bought by the Royal Air Force. Truly international business, this. Anyway, our friend Armin Faber, he was attacked by a Czechoslovakian pilot called František Trečnar, and they did all of this sort of stuff. And eventually, Faber pulled an Immelmann turn. Now, for those of you that are pilots, you may have read about an Immelmann turn. Some of you may have even done it. This is where you dive the aeroplane, and as you come up and over, and this is why you need double jointed wrists, you roll out. Anyway, he did this wonderful turn and he got head to head with František Trečnar and shot him down. The good news is František actually survived the experience and landed by parachute. Now, Faber looks at his dials on his instrument board, realises that it's time to go home, the famous home for tea and medals routine, and looked at his compass and set a course for his home airfield. Well, no, he didn't. He thought he did. And he went zozzing off in his Focke-Wulf, and he looked at this stretch of water and he thought, the English Channel, he thought, and there on the coast, the other side, he saw an airfield. And being a brilliant pilot, he then flew down the main runway of this airfield and he waggled his wings just to show that he was a brilliant pilot, and he just shot down one of the other lot. Now, this was a little bit of a surprise to the duty pilot at this airfield, because the duty pilot wasn't Herman or Adolf or Fritz. It was a Sergeant Jeffries of the Royal Air Force, and he saw this Focke-Wulf 190 come down his main runway waggling his wings, and he saw him peel off and come in and land, and he grabbed the only weapon that he had available, which was a flare pistol. It was the only weapon he'd got, and he ran across the aeroplane and he stuck this pistol into Armin Faber's face and detained him, because Faber hadn't crossed the English Channel and he hadn't got back to France, and he wasn't going to get any medals because he'd flown, instead of flying south-east, he'd flown north-west, and he landed at a Royal Air Force airfield at Pembrey in Wales. So there we are, the story of a Faber, brilliant pilot, lousy navigator, and he presented the Royal Air Force with a perfect Focke-Wulf 190 that they could fly and test and play with and work out how it worked. So there we are. Good morning to all of you.